The air is thin, biting, and smells of wet iron and stale tobacco. It is 2 o'clock in the morning, January 1942, on the outskirts of a nameless village near the Don River. For the Soviet defenders huddled in their shallow, timber-reinforced bunkers, the night is an ocean of black, broken only by the rhythmic, ghostly pulse of distant flares. Then the sound changes. It isn't the sharp crack of a bolt-action rifle or the predictable whistle of a mortar. It is a mechanical, guttural growl, heavy, low, and rhythmic. Suddenly, the darkness is not just broken, it is obliterated. A localized sun ignites. A jet of pressurized, thickened fuel screams across the snow, a liquid rope of white-hot orange that clings to everything it touches. The shadows cast by the skeletal trees don't just move, they sprint. In an instant, the sub-zero temperatures vanish, replaced by a heat so intense it cracks the stone-frozen earth and sucks the oxygen from the lungs of every man within 50 yards. For those in the path of the Flampanzer, the war has ceased to be a matter of ballistics or bravery. It has become a primal, suffocating struggle against a weapon that does not merely kill, but erases. The night has turned to day, and the day is made of fire. The horror of the flame tank did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the refined evolution of a nightmare that had haunted the European consciousness since the First Great War. In 1915, at the bloody edges of the Western Front, the German Empire introduced the Flammenwerfer, a portable device that turned a man into a dragon. But these early units were fragile. The operators were slow, burdened by heavy canisters of fuel, and easily picked off by snipers. By the time the world spiraled toward a second global conflict, military theorists across Europe, from Berlin to London, realized that the only way to make fire a viable tactical tool on the modern, fast-moving battlefield was to wrap in steel. The concept was simple but technically harrowing. Take the chassis of a proven main battle tank, strip away its traditional high-velocity gun or secondary armaments, and replace them with a high-pressure projector capable of throwing liquid death. For Germany, this journey began in earnest with the Panzer II. Originally designed as a reconnaissance vehicle, its small frame was deemed perfect for the Flam conversion. 2 external fuel tanks were mounted on the fenders, feeding 2 small turrets that could pivot and spray. It was a terrifying sight, yet it was merely a prototype for the chaos to come. The goal was no longer just to destroy a tank. It was to clear the unclearable, the deep concrete bunkers of the Maginot Line, the jagged ruins of Stalingrad, and the dense hedgerows of France. As the 1930s drew to a close and the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg doctrine took shape, the role of the flame tank became specialized. It wasn't intended for tank-on-tank duels or long-range engagements. Instead, it was an assault engineer on tracks. While the standard panzers punched through the lines, the flame tanks were the janitors of the battlefield, brought forward to incinerate pockets of resistance that refused to surrender. The German High Command saw fire not just as a weapon of destruction, but as a weapon of absolute psychological submission. They knew that while a soldier might brave a machine gun nest, the prospect of being bathed in unquenchable, sticky fuel was a different matter entirely. This strategic reliance on terror would dictate the design of the Flampanzer III, which replaced the 50mm gun of the standard Panzer III with a massive 14mm flame projector, turning one of the war's most reliable workhorses into a specialized engine of incineration. As the German Flampanzer units began to leave their mark on the Eastern Front, the Allied powers were forced to confront the same brutal reality. Traditional high explosives were often insufficient against deep, reinforced fortifications. The British, in particular, looked at the mounting casualties in the Mediterranean and the looming necessity of an invasion of Fortress Europe and decided they needed something far more formidable than the lightly armored German variants. The result was the Churchill Crocodile. Unlike the German designs that housed fuel internally or on exposed fenders, the Crocodile utilized an armored trailer towed behind the tank, carrying 400 gallons of fuel. This allowed the tank to retain its heavy frontal armor and its primary 75mm gun, making it arguably the most successful and terrifying flame-throwing vehicle of the entire war. The technological race wasn't just about the vehicles, but the cocktail they fired. Early in the war, flame tanks used simple mixtures of petrol and oil, which burned quickly and dissipated in the air. This was insufficient for the tactical demands of 1944. Scientists on both sides developed thickened fuel, a gelatinous substance that acted like napalm. When fired, it didn't just spray, it flew in a coherent, sticky rod of fire that could skip off walls and flow into the air vents of bunkers. By the time the United States entered the fray in the Pacific, they had perfected the Zippo tanks, modified M4 Shermans that became the only way to root out entrenched Japanese defenders in the volcanic caves of Iwo Jima. By 1944, the deployment of flame tanks had become a standardized part of heavy assault doctrine. The German Panzerabteilung F units were organized into specialized battalions, often held in reserve until a breakthrough was halted by a hard target. These machines were the final argument of a general. They represented a shift in the morality of the battlefield, a transition from the clean kill of a bullet to a method of warfare that was undeniably visceral. The sky over Europe was increasingly dominated by these pillars of black smoke, marking the spots where steel and fire met human will. The stage was set for a series of engagements where the mere sight of a flame tank's ignition pilot light was enough to break the spirit of seasoned veterans. To understand the flame tank, one must first look through the eyes of the engineer, the men who mastered the volatile chemistry of the burning death. By 1944, the substance being projected was no longer mere gasoline. It was a sophisticated, thickened gel, often utilizing aluminum soap or latex to create a substance that behaved like liquid glue. This was the science of persistence. When a Churchill Crocodile or a Flampanzer III fired, the fuel didn't just explode on contact. It splattered and clung to surfaces, burning at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees C. The physics of the rod of fire allowed it to bounce off interior walls, a process known as flowing fire. An engineer knew that if they could get a jet of this gel through a single vision slit or air vent, the fire would follow the oxygen, turning a ventilated concrete bunker into a pressurized oven in seconds. From the commander's perspective, the flame tank was never a tool of finesse. It was a psychological sledgehammer. Tactically, these vehicles were utilized as force multipliers during the final phase of an assault. A commander didn't send flame tanks to scout or to hold ground. They were summoned when the infantry was pinned down by a hard point that artillery couldn't reach. The commander's role was one of cold calculation, deciding when the morale of the enemy had dipped low enough that a single burst of fire would trigger a mass surrender. In many cases, commanders observed that the mere presence of a flame-throwing unit, identified by its unique, thick-barreled projector, caused enemy troops to abandon their positions before a single drop of fuel was ignited. It was the most efficient way to end a stalemate, albeit the most gruesome. The moral angle of these machines creates a dark stain on the history of mechanized warfare. Even in the heat of a total war, there was an unwritten code among many soldiers, and flame tanks violated every line of it. To many, the use of fire was seen as unsoldierly, a cruel departure from the honest combat of rifles and grenades. This created a harrowing reality for the crews. If a flame tank was disabled, the crew could rarely expect the mercy of being taken prisoner. Infantrymen who had watched their comrades incinerated often executed flame tank operators on the spot. The moral weight wasn't just on the victims, but on the men behind the glass, who had to live with the knowledge that their primary weapon did not just kill the enemy, but transform them into something unrecognizable. From the enemy's perspective, the flame tank was the ultimate personification of helplessness. Soldiers who survived encounters with these machines spoke not of the pain, but of the sound, a terrifying, percussive whoosh followed by the roar of 1,000 torches. In the narrow confines of a trench or the dark corners of a cellar, there was nowhere to hide. The fire didn't just burn, it consumed the very air. As the thickened fuel ignited, it rapidly depleted the oxygen in enclosed spaces, meaning that even those not touched by the flames often died of asphyxiation or carbon monoxide poisoning. The psychological trauma was so profound that it led to the flame panic, a phenomenon where entire platoons would break and run into open machine gun fire rather than remain in a bunker targeted by a flame tank. The operator's perspective was one of constant, sweating anxiety. Driving a flame tank was akin to sitting atop a massive, pressurized bomb. In a Churchill Crocodile, the fuel was towed in a vulnerable trailer. In a German Flammpanzer III, the fuel tanks were housed inside the hull, protected by the same armor as the crew. If a shaped charge or an anti-tank rifle penetrated those specific zones, the result was a catastrophic internal inferno that left no chance for escape. Operators lived with the smell of fuel constantly in their nostrils, a scent that became synonymous with their own potential demise. They were also social outcasts within their own armies. Other tankers often avoided them in camp, wary of the death magnets they drove and the grim nature of their specialized work. Finally, we must consider the technological angle of the evolution of the nozzle and the ignition system. To the men who designed these machines, the challenge was preventing the flame from clogging or extinguishing mid-flight. The transition from spark plug ignition to the use of a continuous pilot light or white phosphorus grenades at the tip of the projector was a major leap. This allowed for cold shooting, the ability to douse a target in unignited, sticky fuel first, letting it seep into every crack before flicking a switch to turn the entire structure into a fireball. This level of technical cruelty was the peak of 1940s chemical engineering, turning a primitive element into a precision-guided tool of destruction. The true, terrifying potential of the flame tank was realized during the Siege of Brest in September 1944. This was not a battle of sweeping maneuvers across open fields. It was a grueling room-by-room struggle for one of the most heavily fortified ports in Nazi-occupied France. The German defenders, many from the elite 2nd Fallschirmjäger Division, had retreated into massive, concrete U-boat pens and Vauban-era fortresses. These structures were immune to standard 75mm tank rounds and even heavy aerial bombardment. The Allied advance had stalled, bleeding out in the rubble-strewn streets. It was here that the Churchill Crocodiles of the 141st Regiment, Royal Armored Corps, were unleashed to break the stalemate. On the morning of September 16th, a single crocodile lumbered toward a reinforced German pillbox that had held up an entire battalion of U.S. Rangers for 2 days. The German paratroopers inside were veterans, hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front. They watched as the tank approached, its thick, snub-nosed projector pointing directly at their embrasure. At 150 yards, the crocodile fired a dry shot, a drenching spray of unignited, thickened fuel that coated the facade of the bunker and seeped through the narrow firing slits. For a few heartbeats, there was a terrifying silence. Then, the crocodile's operator engaged the igniter. A second jet of fire chased the first, and the entire face of the bunker vanished in a rolling cloud of orange and black. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The liquid fire followed the draft of the bunker's ventilation, spiraling into the lower chambers where the ammunition and oxygen were stored. Those who weren't instantly incinerated faced a more lingering death as the fire consumed the oxygen in seconds, creating a vacuum that collapsed lungs and triggered cardiac arrest. When the Rangers finally entered the fortification, they found no one standing. The unbreakable defense had been neutralized in less than a minute. This became the template for the rest of the siege. The crocodile would lead, the fire would clear the path, and the German will to resist would evaporate. By the time Brest surrendered on September 19th, the German commander, General Hermann Bernhard Ramke, specifically cited the inhumane effectiveness of the flame tanks as a primary reason for his capitulation. While the sieges of France proved the flame tank's power against concrete, it was in the claustrophobic green hell of the Normandy bocage and the night-shattered ruins of the Italian Gothic line that these machines became truly legendary. In late 1944, the war had entered a phase of grinding attrition. German defenders had perfected the art of the hidden nest, camouflaged anti-tank positions, and machine gun pits buried deep within the roots of ancient, thousand-year-old hedgerows. A standard tank entering these lanes was a sitting duck. But when night fell, the Allied commanders began to use the flame tanks not just for destruction, but for illumination and psychological dominance. During the breakout from the Cannes sector, the Churchill crocodiles were deployed in the dead of night to clear the Black Orchards. The sight was something out of a medieval nightmare. As the tanks moved forward, they unleashed continuous bursts of fire that reached over 120 yards. The thickened fuel hit the dense vegetation and exploded into towering pillars of light. To the German soldiers watching from the dark, it appeared as if the horizon itself was screaming. The flame tanks turned night into day, but it was a day born of phosphorus and petroleum. The light was so intense that Allied infantry could see to navigate and shoot as if it were noon, while the German defenders were blinded by the glare and the smoke. The climax of this technical terror occurred during the crossing of the Senio River in Italy, April 1945. The British Eighth Army deployed a massive wall of fire using Wasp flamethrowers, Bren carriers equipped with flame projectors, and Churchill crocodiles. Over 50 flame-throwing vehicles lined the riverbank and fired simultaneously across the water. It was the largest concentrated use of flame weapons in human history. The river itself appeared to be on fire as the fuel floated on the surface, and the German 26th Panzer Division, one of the most disciplined units left in the Wehrmacht, simply broke. Men who had survived years of traditional shelling threw down their arms and fled in a blind panic. The turning point was no longer a specific hill or a bridge. It was the realization that the era of the static defender was over. In the face of mechanized fire, there was no cover left in the world. The silence that followed the end of a flame tank assault was never a peaceful one. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the crackle of cooling metal and the hiss of smoldering embers. As the smoke cleared from the ruins of places like Brest, the Senio River, and the hedgerows of Normandy, the physical cost of this weapon became undeniably clear. For the German defenders, the casualty rates in units targeted by flame tanks were staggering, not necessarily in the number of dead, but in the proportion of those deaths that left no remains to be identified. Military reports from 141st Regiment, Royal Armored Corps, noted that in many engagements, the number of prisoners taken increased tenfold the moment a crocodile entered the field. The aftermath was often characterized by a surrender of shock, where survivors were found in a state of catatonic stupor, their nervous systems shattered by the sheer intensity of the heat and noise. For the crews of the flame tanks, the aftermath brought a different kind of burden. They were the victors, but they were also the most hated men on the battlefield. Captured German documents and testimonies from Allied veterans reveal a grim postscript to these engagements, the no-quarter rule. Because the flame tank was viewed as a weapon of extreme cruelty, its operators were frequently excluded from the protections of the Geneva Convention by the men they fought. If a Churchill crocodile or a Flampanzer was tracked and the crew forced to bail out, their chances of reaching a prisoner of war camp were slim. In many sectors of the Western Front, it was an open secret that flame tank crews were to be shot on sight. This led to a psychological hardening of the operators, who knew that their only safety lay behind the thick steel plates of their machines and the terrifying reach of their projectors. The destruction of infrastructure was equally absolute. Unlike conventional high explosives, which shattered structures, the flame tanks thickened fuel seeps into the very pores of brick and stone. Towns that witnessed flame tank combat weren't just ruined, they were sterilized. The heat was often so intense that it warped the structural steel of buildings and calcified concrete, rendering the remaining shells of houses uninhabitable and unrepairable. As the Allied and Soviet armies squeezed the Third Reich into a smaller and smaller pocket, the trail of the flame tanks could be followed by the scorched earth they left behind, a literal blackened path leading toward the heart of Berlin. The weapon had achieved its tactical goal, but it had done so by leaving a scar on the landscape that would take decades to heal. As the dust of 1945 settled, the legacy of the flame tank underwent a rapid and clinical evaluation by the victors. The British Army's official reports on the Churchill crocodile were glowing in their tactical praise, citing that the weapon had saved countless thousands of Allied lives by forcing the surrender of entrenched positions that would have otherwise required costly infantry charges. However, beneath the strategic satisfaction lay a deep-seated unease. The sheer efficiency of the burning death prompted a shift in how the world viewed incendiary warfare. While the flame tank had been a hero of the breakthrough, it was quickly becoming a pariah of the peace. The technological data gathered from captured German Flampanzer units and the performance of the Allied Zippos fueled the next generation of chemical warfare research. The transition from simple oil-based fuels to the more stable, more adhesive napalm B was a direct result of the field data collected during the clearing of the European bunkers. Yet, even as the technology improved, the platforms changed. The advent of the shoulder-fired rocket and more sophisticated anti-tank guided missiles made the slow, lumbering flame tank a liability on the modern, high-mobility battlefield. By the late 1950s, most major powers began to phase out specialized flame tanks in favor of man-portable systems or incendiary airstrikes, effectively ending the era of the armored fire breather. Perhaps the most significant aftermath was the psychological and legal shift. The horrific nature of the injuries caused by flame tanks contributed heavily to the post-war discourse on unnecessary suffering. The images of charred fortifications and the testimonies of those who witnessed the liquid day helped pave the way for future international protocols, such as the 1980 Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which placed strict limitations on the use of incendiary weapons against civilian populations or in areas where they could cause excessive collateral damage. The flame tank had done its job too well. It had shown humanity a version of war that was so visually and physically repulsive that the world spent the next several decades trying to ensure it would never have to be seen again on such a massive scale. The flame tank remains one of the most polarizing icons of the Second World War, a machine that occupied the thin, blurred line between military necessity and industrial cruelty. To the generals, it was a miracle of engineering that broke the back of the most stubborn defenses, a tool that ultimately shortened the war and spared the lives of their own infantry. But to the men who stood on either side of the flame, it represented something far darker: the total dehumanization of the enemy. In the glare of the burning gel, a soldier was no longer a man to be outfought or outmaneuvered. He was a problem to be liquidated. Today, the Flampanzers and Crocodiles are largely gone, replaced by precision-guided munitions and digital warfare. Most of the specialized vehicles were scrapped or left to rust in the quiet corners of tank museums, their thick-walled fuel trailers now empty and silent. Yet, the memory of those nights where night turned to day persists in the archives and the nightmares of the few survivors left. These machines forced humanity to look into a mirror and ask how much of its own soul it was willing to sacrifice for victory. They proved that while steel can protect a man and fire can win a battle, the combination of the two creates a terror that lingers long after the smoke is cleared. Ultimately, the story of the flame tank is not just a chronicle of armor and chemical compounds. It is a meditation on the limits of endurance. It serves as a grim reminder that in the heat of total conflict, the most primitive element of nature, fire, was reclaimed by modern science to become the ultimate arbiter of the battlefield. As we look back at the charred ruins of the 1940s, we are reminded that some weapons do more than just destroy the present. They cast a long, scorching shadow over our understanding of what it means to wage a civilized war.